Before we can begin to understand reproduction, we need to understand a couple of genetics-related terms or designations here. So in this figure we have N and we have 2N. And so N refers to the idea of being haploid. Haploid means having one of each kind of chromosome. And perhaps you knew this at this point, but if you didn't, here it is. Humans have 23 different pairs of chromosomes. So a total of 46 chromosomes, and so 23 pairs, and each pair is a chromosome. One of those of each pair came from mama, and one of each pair came from daddy. And basically, whatever's on chromosome, let's say 3, from mama is going to be the same sort of thing that's on chromosome 3 that came from daddy. One of those might call for brown hair, the other one might call for blonde hair, but it's nonetheless in the same location, having the same kind of information present on it. So haploid means only one set, so only 23 total chromosomes. That really means one of each chromosome. And so that means daddy's going to contribute a sperm, which is haploid, containing 23 individual chromosomes, and mama contributes a haploid egg containing 23. So that once fertilization occurs, sperm contributes its 23 chromosomes into the egg with the egg's 23 chromosomes to return the zygote, that is the fertilized egg, to a 2N condition or a diploid condition in which it has 2 sets of each thing. So diploid means 2 sets of each thing, 2N is referring to that, and haploid, or N, just has one of each chromosome in place. And what's important about that is that if we have sperm that has half the amount of DNA required and an egg which has half the amount of DNA required, when sperm and egg get together, then we have the full set. If the resulting sperm produced from that child perhaps, or the egg, each had a full set, so 46 individual chromosomes, that would mean a sperm with 46 got together with an egg with 46, and now all of a sudden we have almost 100 individual chromosomes in there, and we really physically don't have room for that, for one. And it turns out that humans don't work properly when the chromosome number is off, when there's not the correct number available. So it's a way that sperm and egg are made ensures that the correct number, hopefully, of chromosomes end up producing that offspring. So let's start out with the male system here, and we'll start out with the source of the sperm and also the source of testosterone. Testosterone levels really drive the rate of sperm production. It drives a male's sex drive and a lot of physical characteristics about a male. All the things that make a male appear male are testosterone driven. So it's really a big deal. And the testosterone is produced in the testes. That also drives in the production of sperm in the testes. And it's kind of a very impressive process. But the testes are packed with little tiny tubes called seminiferous tubules. And if you would stretch out the seminiferous tubules in the testicles, you would discover that there's somewhere over a half mile of seminiferous tubules in the testes. So if I told you that every day the testes produce 100 million new sperm, that seems like a phenomenal number. 100 million new ones every day. If I told you they were genetically unique from each other, so that means there's 100 million new genetic combinations produced every day, that's another mind-blowing consideration. And so the process of making sperm and eggs is called meiosis. And really it's a relatively complicated process, but the end result is that it makes lots and lots of, in this case, sperm. They're all haploid, having only one of each chromosome, and there's 100 million new ones a day. So if you have that half mile or more of tubing, that's a microscopic tubing, and each slice of that tubing under a microscope contains hundreds and hundreds of sperm, now it seems a little bit more doable to make the 100 million per day. The average ejaculate, by the way, is going to contain about 300 million sperm. So about 3 days worth of production of sperm per ejaculate. And that's a numbers game. The more sperm you throw towards an egg, the more likely it is that enough of them will get there to actually fertilize the egg. And I think the book states that an average ejaculate contains 100 million sperm. That's incorrect. Unfortunately, there are a lot of things in this book that are incorrect, and that's one of them. It's really more like 300 million, not 100 million. It would seem like perhaps 100 million would be plenty, but it turns out that you really need those 300 million to fertilize an egg on a regular basis, because every step along the way, lots and lots of those sperm die. So if you start out with an appropriate number, enough of them probably will make it all the way to the egg. But if you start out with 100 million, I know that's a lot, but that's a third of the normal amount, you're probably going to have some fertility issues there. So numbers is a big deal. The sperm are made in the testis and then move into the epididymis, which is wrapped right around the testicle. The epididymis then connects up to the vas deferens. Sometimes you'll see that referred to as ductus deferens. It's the same thing. And that tube is going to be where sperm continue to mature. So they're not really mature and ready to swim until they're ejaculated. And that might be anywhere from 1 to 3 months after they're produced, before they're actually ready to go and are actually ejaculated. And that vas deferens loops back up over the pubic bones, actually, around into the abdominal cavity, then back around and eventually plugs into the penis. So the sperm are made in the testicle, which is technically outside the body in terms of cavities, but it's contained inside the scrotum. And the scrotum is a relatively thin layer of skin whose job is to contain the testes. And some people might suggest that the scrotum provides protection for the testicle. That's completely inaccurate. There's no protective function carried out by that layer of skin. Really, the entire job of the scrotum is temperature regulation. It turns out that sperm like it cooler than the normal body temperatures. So if the normal body temperature is 98.6, sperm like it more like 95. And that doesn't seem like a big deal in terms of temperature, but to something as small as a sperm, a couple of degrees difference is a really big difference. So if the testes are out in the scrotum and the scrotum adjusts itself either closer to the body or further away from the body, that's a built-in temperature regulation mechanism. So they loop up through the vas deferens into the body cavity, and when they reach some more tubing here, it connects to the rest of the system. But perhaps at this point you're wondering, why is it that the testes are outside? They travel back up inside to eventually come back out. Why didn't they just plug straight into the penis from the scrotum? That would be more efficient. And it would, but the answer to that is the testicles were actually up in the abdominal cavity before the baby was born. And at or shortly after or around birth, typically the testes will descend. So they'll find a place, there's a little canal in the abdominal wall that they can squeeze through and then descend down into the scrotum to get out of the hot body cavity and be able to properly function out in the scrotum. And so the vas deferens was connected, and I guess when the testicle was inside the body, it was directly plugged into the penis. But since it had to get out somehow, it sort of had the tubing trail along behind it, so you go from outside to inside, then back to outside again. And so it's all connected based on how it was originally plumbed together. So hopefully that makes sense for that. In the case of a non-descended testicle, perhaps a testicle or maybe both testicles don't descend into the scrotum, at some point the doctor has to make a decision to go in and surgically remove them and pull them out and put them into the scrotum. Otherwise, that individual will experience perhaps some fertility problems, certainly some sperm motility problems when things got too hot and caused mutations. It increases the risk of testicular cancer and some other things like that. So proper descension of the testicle into the scrotum is important. And if that hasn't happened, probably by the age of somewhere around 2, I would think, the doctor is going to become concerned about that and start considering at least some options to make that happen. And it could be surgically just reaching in, grabbing hold of them and sticking them into the scrotum where they need to be. So when that vas deferens loops back around into the system, it actually goes over the top of and behind the bladder, and then connects up to the rest of the system. And the first thing it connects to are seminal vesicles. Seminal vesicles are some accessory organs of reproduction. They make some fluid. So sperm itself only comprises about 10% of the total ejaculate. So the other 90% of that total amount of stuff that is ejaculated is something other than sperm. So the seminal vesicle adds some fluid, the prostate gland adds some fluid, the bulbourethral gland adds some fluid, and those fluids are going to do a couple of things. One is they're going to provide food for the sperm in the form of sugars. Sperm are so small that they can't store much in the way of energy inside the sperm, so you have to provide it with the sperm in the ejaculate so it can, I guess you can say, eat on the road. Some of those fluids are going to neutralize the acidity of the urethra, and that's where this semen is going to go. So sperm plus all these other fluids is going to go into the urethra, and it will pass through the urethra out of the penis during ejaculation. But that urethra is going to be acidic because it also is the passageway of urine from the bladder outside the body. So in the middle of the prostate gland there, you can see where the ejaculatory duct hooks up with the prostatic urethra, which is the little part of the urethra here going through the middle of the prostate gland from the bladder. Then once you exit the prostate gland, it's just regular urethra from there on out. So the acidic urine left behind the system needs to be neutralized. Also the vagina, which is the delivery location for the sperm, is quite acidic. So we need some chemicals there to neutralize that acidity, because acidic environments will kill the sperm, and that's counterproductive. There are some chemicals here that are going to stimulate the sperm to actually swim. So up until this point, you could take sperm out of the testicle, out of the vas deferens, and place it in a test tube, and it's not going to swim. It's just not capable because it hasn't matured and it hasn't received these chemical activators yet. There's going to be lubricant in these excretions from these glands to lubricate the urethra so that the semen travels through faster with less loss of volume along the way. So all kinds of things being added to the system here as well. There's also some chemicals that suppress the female immune system. Otherwise, the female immune system would recognize a sperm as being a foreign invader and kill it. So all that stuff gets mixed in here at the point of ejaculation, and then that semen is launched out of the penis at an incredible rate of speed. The thought is the faster and harder it's launched from the male body, the farther it's going to travel under that jet propulsion, if you will, and that means the less distance the sperm have to swim. To find an egg at the right location, they're going to have to swim probably around 12 to 16 inches, which doesn't seem like that big of a deal, but in the world of a sperm again, that's like a human trying to swim from, let's say, England to New York City. That's really kind of a big deal. So the launch is very important there for that. The closer it can get to the opening of the cervix and the uterus, the better off the sperm is going to be. Because the ejaculatory duct here and the urethra goes through the prostate gland, as a male ages, the prostate gland grows, and that's normal, but also it can grow too much, and it can cause prostate cancer. It can cause enlarged prostate, which causes urinary retention from a urinary perspective, but can also interfere with flow of sperm through the system. So as a male ages, the prostate gland can get in the way of both the reproductive system and urinary system functions. We see in this picture here the glans penis. That's the head of the penis, and so the rest of the penis itself was just considered penis or shaft of penis. But at birth, there is a foreskin present. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the foreskin right now because that's part of your reading assignment. Make sure you do that. There's some very enlightening material there that is unfortunately accurate and happens all over the world. But in a male, it's common that the foreskin is removed by a process called circumcision. That has its origins in ancient Jewish teachings and beliefs. These days doesn't have a whole lot to do with that, at least in the United States. It's just something that has become a cultural practice. And so there are pros and cons to that idea, and those are discussed in that reading assignment as well. So anyway, it's present until and unless removed. If we consider the penis itself, it's actually consisting of 3 different groups of tissue. The upper 2 groups here are labeled as erectile tissue, and it's sort of like spongy tissue that when blood flows into it, it blows it up like a balloon. So an erection is actually achieved by blood pressure inside the penis increasing, just like blowing up a balloon. And as long as the blood flows into the penis, faster than or as fast as it flows out, that erection is produced and then maintained. That is an essential part of achieving an orgasm and an ejaculation. And in a male, ejaculation, that is release of reproductive cells, is dependent upon orgasm. So the male must experience a pleasure of orgasm to be able to release reproductive cells. And no orgasm, no ejaculation. From the female perspective, orgasm and ovulation is the female equivalent, have nothing to do with each other. So females ovulate all the time, get no particular pleasure from that because it didn't go along with the idea of orgasm at all. But here in this case, the erectile tissue fills up with blood. And if an erection isn't achieved or isn't maintained properly, that's referred to as erectile dysfunction. And I think everybody in the world knows that take a Viagra and that might fix it. Basically, in that case, what's happening is blood is flowing out of the penis faster than it's flowing in is the most likely scenario there. Or there may be some hormone issues, a whole list of things that could cause erectile dysfunction. But the point is, it's a blood flow issue either way. You don't have proper blood flow into and out of the penis if erections aren't properly achieved and maintained. And it's interesting that when you look at the information for Viagra, it says in the warnings and disclaimers that an erection lasting longer than 4 hours is not normal. It is in fact a problem. And that's always been somewhat humorous to me to think of anyone who would actually think that it was normal for an erection to last 4 hours or more. That just doesn't happen. If you've anyone who has a penis would know that. So it's just an interesting thing that they have to put in there legally, but really it should have been common sense, I would have thought. The lower part of the penis here also has some erectile tissue around it, but running through the middle of it you find the urethra. So we already said the urethra was where the urine is going to pass through and where the semen is going to pass through. And the point of this erectile tissue in this section is not to achieve or maintain an erection, but rather to become somewhat engorged with blood, but not overly so that it holds the urethra actually open. And so the semen then has an easier time of going through because the channel is held wide open and is somewhat helped to avoid being kinked off by having this erectile tissue around it somewhat filled with blood, but nowhere near as solidly packed with blood as the top 2 erectile tissues would be. So that's really the process of an erection, is blood flows in faster than it flows out. When blood flows out faster than it flows in, the erection goes away. Both of those things can happen in a matter of, I guess, seconds either way. Typically is achieved and then is lost over the course of maybe a minute or two. But that's going to vary greatly from one person to the next. If we look at this process of making sperm, it's quite a complicated process. But here we see the seminiferous tubules packed in there. And if we looked at a single seminiferous tubule sliced through, it would look like this. And all these little hair-like filaments projecting into the middle of this opening here are tails of sperm that are in production, and they would be in this stage of production right here. So they're moving through, they're being made. And if you have a half mile or more of this kind of tubing, and this is a 100 times magnification, which has then been magnified a couple hundred more times to make this picture size. So there's phenomenal sperm production capacity there. So what happens is we take this stem cell here, and then it divides, and those cells then divide again. So we would actually have 4 of these, and then basically from each of these processes we can get 4 complete sperm. So it doesn't take very many divisions of actual cells to get 100 million new sperm in that process. Really, from every one of these diploid stem cells here, we could get 8 functional sperm at the end. So we're looking at somewhere around 12.5 million of those would need to go through this division process every day. Still a really phenomenal number, but again, 12 million cells going through a division process sounds a little bit more understandable and believable than 100 million new cells being made, but really it results in the same thing. So this sperm really is a head that contains DNA, a middle piece, which is basically the motor that powers the tail. And so this is a swimming DNA capsule is what it is. So once it's ejaculated, it's out of the male's control and nothing else can be done with it. It's on its own. It's then headed for the female. And so it's going to then be ejaculated into the vagina. We'll get to the vagina in a minute, but we're going to work through the female the same way we did the male. So we'll start with the ovaries. And the ovaries are basically the female equivalent of testicles. And their job is to produce estrogen, the female version of testosterone, and also to produce eggs. And if the estrogen levels are proper, then egg production will be proper. But it's interesting to note here that a female has produced all of the eggs in the ovaries that will ever be produced before she's born. Males don't start even producing sperm at all until puberty, but females have produced all the eggs that will ever be produced before they're born. Then it's just a chance of them developing, ovulating, and perhaps being fertilized that occurs later in life. So there's a little bit of a time delay there. Males from start to finish, it can be done in perhaps a month, month and a half from start to finish. But females are literally looking at years from when the eggs were made until they're actually finished developing and then ovulated and do their thing. So the ovaries are connected then to uterine tubes or fallopian tubes. But they're not directly connected. They're just in close proximity to each other. So when the egg pops out of the ovary, actually it needs to be sucked into the fallopian tube. And those little fimbriae, those little fingers, are kind of creating a vacuum into the fallopian tube. And hopefully they suck the egg in. Then up there at what I would call the wrist of the fallopian tube, here would be this section right here. If we look over here, here's the wrist connected to the hands with lots of fimbriae fingers. So right in here is the ideal location for sperm and egg to actually meet and then result in fertilization. And we'll get to that later on, but timing is really important here. Sperm needs to get to the egg at the right point, otherwise the whole system is going to not work. So we're going to assume the egg got sucked into the fallopian tube like it was supposed to be, but if it doesn't, and it gets fertilized outside of the out in the abdominal cavity somewhere, that egg could be floating around next to the small intestines or large intestines, or who knows where it could float around in there. And it gets fertilized out there. That's called an ectopic pregnancy. And really there are 2 different kinds of ectopic pregnancy. One of them is I would call a tubal ectopic pregnancy, when the egg actually implants in the fallopian tube itself. There's only one possible outcome for that pregnancy, and that is termination of the pregnancy. If the doctor doesn't do it, the mother's body will. And if it's left for the mother's body to do, it puts the mother's survival at serious risk. Because the rupture of fallopian tube is a very potentially fatal kind of scenario. So in the event of a tubal pregnancy, there's going to be a lot of pain only a couple of weeks into the process. And anytime you have a lot of pain, you need to talk to the doctor about that relative to pregnancy. And if they look and find that it's a tubal pregnancy, the fallopian tube is stretching and it's not designed to stretch, they're immediately going to look at terminating that pregnancy. And at that point, I personally wouldn't call it abortion. I know abortion is a really ugly word to some people. Really, it's just a clinical way of saying termination of pregnancy. But in this case, there's not really an option. That developing potential baby there is going to die no matter what you do or don't do. So abortion is termination of something that maybe had a chance, I guess. But if the doctor doesn't terminate this one, the mother's body will. So I personally don't see anything controversial about termination of a pregnancy that's occurring in the fallopian tubes, because biologically it has 0 chance of survival. And mama has significantly reduced chances of survival, and I don't think anybody wants that. Another option is it could get fertilized out there in the abdominal cavity and implant into the intestines or some other organ there to get its blood supply. And theoretically, that baby could grow, be alive to term, but then the question is, how does it get out? Because it's not part of the normal exit path here, so it cannot get out on its own at that point. And if that happened, and this is incredibly unlikely that it would happen, but if it were to happen, that would require a C-section, a surgical delivery, because there's no other way for the baby to get through the system and out. It might be advisable that any kind of ectopic, whether it was in the fallopian tube or out in the abdominal cavity, it's probably a good idea to terminate that pregnancy regardless, because the odds are just not good at a positive outcome for baby, and definitely not a good odd of outcome for mama either. Obviously, those are individual choices, but biologically, medically speaking, they're recommended choices. That egg is going to travel down the fallopian tube, assuming it got sucked in like it should have, until it reaches the ovary or the uterus. And that trip is going to take somewhere around 5 to 6 days from ovulation until it enters the uterus. And if it was fertilized at the wrist there, once it reaches the shoulders, where the fallopian tube plugs into the body of the uterus, then the level of development that has occurred inside that fertilized egg should be appropriate for it to get out of its little shell that it's been in, and then implant in the walls of the uterus. And there it would find a source of nutrients. It would find protection from the immune system and other problems. It would find an expandable, stretchy place to grow, where it would then have access to the exit port. So across the board, the uterus is where the pregnancy needs to occur. And really in the top half of the uterus would be the best place, because if it happens too low in the uterus, as it stretches, it's actually going to pull the cervix open, and that will cause lots of other problems. But that's a timing issue again as well. If the timing of fertilization was correct, which really meant the timing of sperm introduction, the timing of intercourse, if that was proper, then there can be fertilization at the right place, there can be implantation of the egg into the uterus at the proper place, and then a reasonable chance of success of that pregnancy. We'll talk a little bit later one source of failed pregnancies, and that is if this process happens too late in the process, then the next menstrual cycle might terminate the pregnancy. So here's really why termination of pregnancy is often not something that needs to be so horribly controversial, is the body itself terminates probably over 50% of all pregnancies. So it's a very natural thing for pregnancies to be terminated because they didn't work with the right timing, they didn't work in the right spot, the right particular order of things didn't happen. That's a completely normal and natural process. So human intervention to ensure that process works in an unsuccessful way is really just mimicking what happens naturally in the body at least 50% of the time probably. But that's a topic that you can obviously develop your feelings on either way, and they're your feelings and you're entitled to them. Regardless what society says these days, I believe you're entitled to feel how you want to feel, and that's your business, not mine. So if that fertilization, if all the timing worked out properly, then you're going to have pregnancy that occurs from that. And pregnancy occurs once that egg implants in the uterus and turns off the next menstrual cycle. And again, that only happens about, maybe on a good day, 50% of the times that the egg actually gets fertilized. And the egg doesn't always get fertilized either, so really, I guess, of all ovulations, all possible pregnancies probably occur less than 1% of the times when there was any possibility of it. The uterus opens up through the cervix into the vaginal canal, and the vagina we would perhaps call it as well, and this is going to be the birth canal. So this is the exit port for the baby, and it's normally not big enough for a baby to pass through, but it does have a significant stretching and expansion capability. So when the baby does come through, it's definitely not a pleasant thing for mama as baby passes through, but it is typically biologically possible. If it's not going to fit through, the doctor can perform an episiotomy. And this is another one of those places where the textbook suggested that episiotomies often occur, and that's not the case. Episiotomies don't typically need to occur because, again, typically the vaginal canal is adequately stretchy to allow that baby's head to go through. But if that's not going to work so well, the doctor can do an episiotomy, and that's a surgical enlargement of the vaginal opening. Basically slicing it open a little bit bigger so that baby can get through. And that probably sounds like an undesirable thing, and certainly it would be. But the options there is, we're going to assume you have a good doctor. You always want a good doctor with a baby. The doctor has determined that if they don't surgically enlarge it, it's going to tear itself bigger. And what that does is a couple of things that aren't good. One is it puts too much pressure on the baby's head. Two is when that tissue starts to tear, there is no way to control how far it tears, in what direction it tears, and how neatly it tears. So the surgical enlargement is a nice clean slice, which means the doctor can pick where it was, how far it went, and where it went. And that's very easy for them to sew back up when it's a nice straight line. But if it's a jagged tear that went everywhere, then that's really difficult to put back together. So this is really designed to, actually it doesn't sound like it, but it's designed to minimize the damage that occurs to the mother's body in the birth process. Once baby slides through that vaginal canal and is out, the head comes out, that's the hard part. The shoulders slip out and the rest of the body just kind of seems to jump out from there. But it's going to still be connected to the uterus with the umbilical cord. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the pregnancy and birth chapter. But it's a very complicated series of reactions that go on there. One thing you notice from this image here is that the bladder is right underneath the uterus. So the uterus typically lays fairly flat towards the front of the body and right on top of the bladder. And as that baby grows in there, the uterus stands up, but it also presses on the bladder. And for females who've ever been pregnant before, the later the pregnancy goes, the bigger the baby gets, the less room there is for the bladder, and you know exactly what kinds of problems happen with that. So, and if you are a male or you've never been pregnant, you can imagine if baby's sitting there and dancing and kicking and flopping around right on top of the bladder, that's problematic. So it's normal, but it's problematic. We notice here as well that the anus and rectum are right there, right behind the vaginal canal, relatively close there. So if the tearing happens too much in the vaginal canal, it could actually tear open into the rectum. That can be an additional problem. But as the baby's pressing through there, it puts enormous pressure on the rectum and anus, and that leads to an increased likelihood of the development of things like anal fissures, hemorrhoids, other wonderfully exciting sounding things can happen there as a completely normal process of labor and delivery. Also, there's typically a bowel movement associated with that as well. It's not something that you typically notice, but that's something that they are expecting and they're prepared for it, so they just deal with it, and it's a normal part of a labor and delivery nurse's job to deal with that, and the patient, the mama in this case, is probably never going to be aware of it. If we look at the external anatomy, so all this stuff so far has been internal anatomy. A great deal of the male was visible externally, but in the female there's not much of the reproductive system that's visible externally. The clitoris, the female version of the penis, is visible externally. And in the case of the penis, that was, again, sharing urinary system and reproductive system. The clitoris in a female has nothing to do with the urinary system. You can see there the urethra actually opens between the clitoris and the vaginal opening. But rather it's there for the sensory component of intercourse, is really the clitoris's function. So the urethra there, then the vaginal opening. And then you also see the labia majora and labia minora. Those are what would have been in the male, the scrotum. And basically that's just the outer folds of tissue that are the opening to the reproductive system. If we look at the production of eggs, we would start over here with our primary follicles, and basically eggs that are very immature. And every month a couple of those get selected and they start this development process. So they go to a secondary follicle, oocyte, and then eventually ovulated as an egg. And so all those eggs that were made before birth, they exist as these primary follicles. And then on a regular basis you move some of those through the development process. So at any one time there are perhaps a couple of dozen eggs that are in development, meaning they're getting ready to ovulate, so that once a month at least one of those probably is available for ovulation. And we're going to assume only one ovulated. That's the standard. Sometimes you know that identical twins, for example, are going to come from one egg that was fertilized by one sperm. Of course, all eggs can only be fertilized by one sperm. But identical twins are one egg, one sperm. After fertilization, they split into two masses. Each mass became a separate baby. Non-identical twins came from two eggs, which were each ovulated by their own sperm, developed and implanted as two totally separate babies. In that case, they're not genetically identical. So identical twins are not only typically very appearance-wise identical, but they're genetically 100% exactly the same because they came from the same egg-sperm combination. After that egg ovulates, and a female who's actually paying attention to her body might actually feel ovulation. It's a little sharp twinge of pain because literally what happens is the ovary explodes and releases that egg. That obviously would have a little bit of discomfort along with it. That spot where the explosion occurred becomes a scar called the Corpus Luteum. And that scar actually carries out a function of producing hormones, which delay the next menstrual cycle, giving that egg a chance to get fertilized, giving it a chance to implant in the uterus and become a pregnancy, and then take over hormone regulation on its own. Once that amount of time, about a week is what it's giving the process here, maybe a week and a half, once that is done, then it stops producing hormones and just becomes a scar. And so over here on the left, we see a scar that's from an ovulation in the past, and there will always be that scar there. So if a female has ovulated 214 eggs at that point in her life, on the ovaries will be a total of 214 scars. So it's interesting that you can look at ovaries and literally tell how many eggs have been ovulated from it by counting those corpus luteum scars. So here's the process of fertilization. This is very, very simplified. We have an egg, our primary oocyte. It goes through the finishing processes of ejecting what we call polar bodies. So if it has 46 chromosomes, that means it's diploid. We don't want it to be diploid, we want it to be haploid. So polar bodies are what happens when the egg is getting rid of that extra 23 chromosomes in preparation for becoming haploid. And you can see that happens really here right before and actually during fertilization. So that's sort of a at the last minute, go ahead and finish up that process to become fully haploid and ready to be fertilized. So what is it that's regulating the ovulatory cycle? It's the same thing that's regulating the menstrual cycle. So let's look at this. The ovulatory cycle up here at the top, and then the menstrual cycle down here at the bottom. So we have this egg, it develops, and then it ovulates. So what was it that made it ovulate? Well, if we look here at FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, they've been going along here at this point, day 0 of the month, not necessarily the first day of the calendar month, but the first day of your ovulatory cycle, and really the first day of your menstrual cycle, even though it's part of the last of the menstrual cycle. That's confusing. We'll get there in a minute. And so at day 1 up through about day 11 or so, these LH and FSH levels are just kind of floating along, not really changing much. Then all of a sudden at day 12, LH spikes, FSH spikes. Then at day 13, or let's say around day, let's just say day 14, just for argument's sake, we get ovulation. So you think that spike that happened a day or two before ovulation had anything to do with it? Yes, obviously it did. And then it goes down immediately after that and goes back to the levels that it was at really before ovulation. If we go down here and look at the menstrual cycle, we see that we have estrogen. It's plugging along, not doing a whole lot until about day 10, then it starts changing. We have progesterone not doing a whole lot until really about day 15 to 17. So if we look at estrogen, estrogen spiked in that day or two before ovulation, along with LH and FSH. So we can say that ovulation occurs when FSH spikes, LH spikes, and estrogen spikes all together. That's sort of like the hormonal trigger to explode that egg out of there. And within about a day after those levels spike, eggs coming out. Which means you can actually do an ovulation test to know hormonally when you are about to ovulate. So if you're wanting to make sure pregnancy occurs, and this is something that's often done in people who are experiencing fertility problems, you actually do a hormone test. It's the same kind of test a pregnancy test is, just a urine test, testing for these levels of hormones to be going up. And once those levels go past a certain point, it is believed that it is most likely going to mean ovulation is about to happen, and so that then helps with timing of things when you want to have that baby. Then for the rest of that month there, again up here at the ovulatory thing, LH and FSH, not much happening. But with estrogen, estrogen levels went down after ovulation and then start coming back up. And progesterone levels start going up after ovulation. So I guess maybe we could say ovulation triggers progesterone to go up. And progesterone up and estrogen up in a prolonged fashion means pregnant. So here they go up, then they come back down. So the trigger for the next menstrual cycle to occur is estrogen crashing and progesterone crashing. Then the next menstrual cycle happens here. So we said timing is key, so here's the deal. Sperm need to be introduced to the system. If ovulation happens on day 14, sperm need to be introduced on day 13. So that they have a day to get up there into the fallopian tubes and be ready for the egg when it enters the rest of the uterus. But there's a bigger important reason than that, and that is that there's not access to the uterus and on through the uterus until about then. So there's a cervical mucus plug that plugs the cervix on a regular basis because the female reproductive system is otherwise wide open to the outside world. It plugs it so bacteria hopefully don't get through, infections don't get through, but it also prevents sperm from getting through. And when those hormones are changing in that preparation for ovulation, so LH, FSH, and estrogen going up, that causes that cervical mucus plug to get thinner and more watery and less gooey, which means that sperm can actually get through now. So if you put sperm there at day 6 or day 7 or day 8, that's nice, but they can't get past the cervical mucus plug and they die in the vagina. End of story. But if you put the sperm in there at about day 13, day 12, probably okay too. It can get through the cervical mucus plug, and it has time to get up to the fallopian tubes and be waiting for when the egg is there, so the timing works out properly. Let's say that happened, and then the egg is actually fertilized on day 14. So by day 15, it's fertilized. We say it's going to take 5 to 6 days to get down to the uterus, and it needs to go through a certain amount of growth and development in that time frame. So if we're fertilized by day 15, by day 20, we're in the uterus. That means we have about 2 to 2.5 days to implant in the uterus and produce enough hormones to maintain an elevated estrogen and progesterone level to prevent the next menstrual cycle from occurring. So the timing was all about preventing the next menstrual cycle. And this is where most of the pregnancies are terminated by the mother's body, is if this didn't happen in time, the next menstrual cycle doesn't get turned off in time, and it flushes the developing ball of cells out. And then it dies. So, and that's actually what the day after pill, by the way, does, is it prevents the egg from implanting in the uterus, which often eggs don't implant in the uterus on their own. Often they implant and then get washed out because the timing was run a little bit behind schedule. So really the day after pill is mimicking something that naturally happens a huge percentage of the time in the female body. I'm not saying that it's okay to use the morning after pill as a regular birth control mechanism. There are better ways. It's called be responsible with the timing of your body and your behavior. But the morning after pill isn't an incredibly artificial murder. It's just making sure that something that often happens in the uterus happens for sure this time. So really it's a relatively natural process that's just, in this case, artificially triggered. So here in the menstrual cycle, we had the first couple days of the menstrual cycle. Actually, we're finishing up the last menstrual cycle, getting the rest of the bleeding done. And what that bleeding was doing was sloughing off this inner lining of the uterus. And that ensures then that the next egg that comes along is going to enter the uterus right over here around day 20 or so. And that's when the uterus has actually fully rebuilt itself. So if a pregnancy occurs, it's guaranteed to start and to be supported by brand new tissue. Otherwise, if that inner lining of the uterus where this baby's going to implant and grow and get its nutrients, if that was tissue that had been sitting there for 30 years, for a 30-year-old female, for example, you've got 30-year-old support tissue. That's not the best. But because the menstrual cycle happens typically every month, then that's really just preparing the uterus to have brand new layers of tissue to support the next possible pregnancy that can occur. If there's no menstrual cycle, there's no ovulation, so that there's no need to prepare. And so those two things are kind of tied together. You have to have a menstrual cycle really to have an ovulatory cycle because they're really running on these same hormone levels. So they're interdependent on each other, and it ensures that everything works out. And if the timing's off, it ensures that it's not going to happen at all. And that timing might be off because there was something wrong with the egg at that point. So that just ensures that, well, it was slow getting here, so something might have been wrong. And so let's just flush it out and not take any chances. So the body is pretty good at basically terminating a lot of pregnancies on its own that have some sort of major problem. Doesn't mean that every problem gets caught and dealt with, but it means that a lot of the really, really ugly ones get caught and dealt with by killing it before it becomes something that you're even aware of as a pregnancy. And typically you're not aware that you're truly pregnant until a couple of weeks, perhaps, after fertilization occurs. Certainly for the first week to week and a half after the fertilization occurs, there's no way in the world you can know because hormone levels haven't changed from what they already were. But when those hormone levels change and stay changed, then the body itself starts changing and the female then becomes aware. You've probably heard of cases where people claimed, I didn't know I was pregnant until the baby came out. I really don't believe that's possible. There are so many changes to the body across the board that I believe that it is impossible to not know. Now, that's probably a major case of denial. Not really not knowing, but not admitting because I don't want to have to deal with it. And if I don't admit it, then maybe it'll go away or something like that. But there's so many huge changes, all of them hormonally driven, well, besides just baby taking up a lot of space anyway, that it'd be really hard to not know at some point. Now, some people would feel changes a little earlier than others, but I'm thinking by the time you've actually been pregnant for a month, you're going to start feeling something being a little different. And by the time 2 months roll around, you've missed a menstrual cycle that you normally probably would have had. That's a good clue that something different is going on here. So a whole list of things that really notify you pregnancy has occurred here. But hopefully you can see at this point it was about timing. If you were a couple of days late on the sperm being there and the egg getting together, then you're a couple days late implanting and you don't get the menstrual cycle turned off and the whole system is awash, literally. Some obstacles to pregnancy at this point is the sperm have to, number one, be functional. They have to be healthy. They have to be properly functional. They have to be activated. They have to survive the acidic urethra, survive the acidic vagina, get through the cervical mucus plug, survive the uterus, which has mama's immune system actively looking for and killing sperm, it has to go up the correct fallopian tube that's actually going to have an egg this month. Because there's no guarantees as to which ovary, the left or the right, will ovulate, and therefore which fallopian tube will have something. So statistically speaking, half the sperm go the wrong way at least, and they're gone there. So you had to take the right turn at the right fallopian tube, survive the fallopian tube, find the egg, be the right one in line for the egg. And the book talks about only needing 20 or 30 sperm to fertilize an egg. That's complete garbage as well. You need millions of them entering the system to survive, so that hundreds to a few thousands of them are at the egg when it's ovulated. And it takes perhaps 50 or more sperm to chew through that outer coating. So the egg has big layers of coating of cells around it that the sperm have to chew their way through. They have to chew their way through the protective shell of the egg itself. So if you're the right one in line, after all the other sperm sitting there have exhausted themselves chewing and dissolving things, then you get to fertilize the egg. But that's pure luck at that point. So you have to survive through all those obstacles along the way. Then you have to be exactly the right one in line. And you have to line up properly with the shell of the egg so that the identification proteins match up. Then you can fertilize. So that's a tremendous number of hoops that have to be gotten through just to fertilize. Then you have to go down the fallopian tube, get the right number of divisions done, get out of the shell of the egg, implant in the uterus before the mama's immune system sees you and kills you, cover yourself up in the uterus, produce hormones, and turn off the next menstrual cycle before it's too late. All those things must be done for pregnancy to occur. That's just to get the baby started in the first place. That's not talking about all the things it takes to build the baby properly. So it's sort of amazing that anyone ever becomes pregnant, much less the idea that sometimes it seems that people looked at each other with a sparkle in their eye and a pregnancy occurred. So a lot of obstacles in the way, but most of the time, those obstacles are something that does get completed appropriately. If you have problems with fertility, then there are a number of things that can be done about that, and that's a whole different discussion altogether, to be had first with an OB and then perhaps with a reproductive endocrinologist. So there are options for people who have fertility problems to go in and figure out where in the system is this process breaking down. Where is something going wrong and what can be done about it? And most problems have something that can be done about it. So that's the good news. And many of those problems are something that actually can be treated with a minimal financial burden. So it doesn't have to be a $30,000 in vitro fertilization attempt that may or may not work. So there are all kinds of possibilities with that. If you have fertility issues and questions, then talk to your doctor. There are lots of options available to you. If you are utilizing birth control pills or some other form of hormonal birth control, whether it's pills or implants or injections, or I hope it's not something like IUDs. IUDs are known to cause lots and lots of problems, probably not worth the benefits that they may provide. But let's just say whatever it is, let's say it's the pill. That's probably the simplest and easiest form available, and probably, quite frankly, the most reliable. You take that new pill, and what happens is you've taken that part way through the ovulatory process, because you can take about a week off in between months. You can take the dummy pill or none at all. And then when you start that up again, that's basically giving your body an increased level of progesterone and estrogen. And what that does is it tells the ovaries and it tells the body you are pregnant, because it's experiencing pregnancy levels of those hormones. And that basically turns off the ovaries and they don't ovulate. So basically it was just tricking the ovaries into staying turned off because it thinks you're already pregnant. And if you're already pregnant, the last thing in the world you need to do is be releasing more eggs, because that could result in multiple pregnancies over multiple time frames, and that's just not something that the body is capable of doing. Really, the human body is capable of producing one baby at a time, and that's what it's built for. Obviously, twins and triplets and things like that can occur, but the more babies you have going on at once, the lower the survival odds are for all of them, and the more likely it is that all of them will have problems. So really, the system is set up for a one-at-a-time system, which is why it's so important that the ovaries turn off when you're pregnant. So those pills are just lying to the ovaries and telling them that you're pregnant. Don't release any more eggs, so you have no more ovulation for that time period. You can actually use those pills as well to manipulate the menstrual cycle and prevent the menstrual cycle from occurring at all. There are some things about that you'd want to talk to the doctor about before you actually did it. Or you can, again, take that 1 week off the pills and allow the menstrual cycle to occur on its own and then start up again. Either way, what it's doing is it's manipulating hormone levels to a pregnancy or a non-pregnancy level, which then manipulates the ovaries to ovulate or to not ovulate. Here's a list of the common methods of contraception, and we're not going to go through this. You can read it yourself. But you see there's a long list there. So it gives the name, what's involved in the process, how it works, its effectiveness, and then the health risks associated with it. And along with this, it does talk about protection against STDs to some case. So you can look through those, but it does give, let's see, male condom, 89% success rate. I'm going to add a caveat to that. That success rate, or that effectiveness rating, is so low, suggesting an 11% fail rate, not because the condom breaks 11% of the time. We're going to assume you're using a condom that is in date. The package has a date on it, by the way, and if it's expired, just like anything else that's expired, it's not guaranteed to work anymore. But that condom has to be used appropriately, and by appropriately it means at the right time. If you're not sure how to use the condom, they come with some description of instructions, and if you pick them up from the health department, you can never say, I can't afford condoms, that's why I didn't use it, because the health department hands them out by the bagful. And at least the health department ones come with a set of instructions stapled to the condom in case you didn't know how to use one. And so literally follow the step-by-step picture instructions on how to use it. But the important thing is that you use it at the appropriate time. And the appropriate time means before the penis enters the vagina. So before intercourse. And this fail rate really comes not again from the condom breaking or failing, but from the user failing to properly use it at the right time. So some people think, well, I'm going to leave the condom off. We're going to engage in intercourse, and right before ejaculation, I'm going to withdraw from the vagina. I'm going to put that condom on, and then go ahead and complete the experience in ejaculation. At that point, I'm covered. But let's be honest. How many people during intercourse keep that good a track of where they are and exactly the best time to stop? Yeah, I thought so. So this 11% fail rate comes not really from the condom itself failing, but from the user failing to properly use the condom at the proper time. Some of those other things there have different rates of success, and some of those are perhaps a little bit optimistic or overly pessimistic. But I would suggest, though, that again, those IUDs, not probably a good idea because they can cause a lot of side effects and some unfriendly problems along the way. Really, the most effective thing here, and really the only thing, that is 100% effective at preventing pregnancy and 100% effective at acquiring STDs is abstinence. Apparently, that's not a popular method these days, but it works. I would also caution, again, from the female perspective, douching is not necessarily a good idea because you're increasing the odds of infections when you do that, and not necessarily getting all the sperm out of the system either. There's always a surgical approach as well. From the male perspective, a vasectomy is literally pulling out the vas deferens out of the scrotum, cutting them, burning them, and implanting them back in tissue walls so they hopefully don't grow back together. From the female perspective, a tubal ligation is going to slice into the abdomen, cut the fallopian tubes, burn them, clamp them out of the way so that they don't grow back together. And what you're doing in those cases is you're preventing sperm and or eggs from getting through the system. And if you do that, then pregnancy doesn't occur. Technically, those are reversible with another surgery, but that's not guaranteed. So it really needs to be considered a permanent birth control mechanism, which may be reversible, but don't assume that it is going to be reversible. From the male perspective, that's an outpatient procedure. It's about a 30-minute surgery process, and then you go home the same day. From the female perspective, it's a major abdominal surgery. So from a biological perspective, probably the vasectomy is a pretty straightforward, simple, preferred process. It doesn't also have to seem to have any hormonal impacts. Whereas for a female, tubal ligation seems to have, and this is getting your tubes tied, by the way, I should have said, does seem to have some lasting hormone imbalance problems, which can lead to uncontrolled weight gain and a number of other things. So aside from the simplicity of the surgery, the male vasectomy seems to have no side effects. There are some misnomers out there, though. You'll read, everywhere you read on the internet about a vasectomy, it says take off Friday, have the surgery on Friday morning, spend the weekend on the couch with a bag of frozen peas, and then Monday everything's normal like nothing ever happens and you go about your life. That's complete and utter garbage. Expect this to be a 2 to 4 week recovery process. Yes, you can move around reasonably normally in a couple of days, but you are not going to feel like everything is normal, like nothing happened, for weeks to a month afterwards. I'm just saying. So somewhere in all the literature you find, they very much downplay that, but do expect it to be a significant form of discomfort and inconvenience for a matter of weeks. Also, it is a effective birth control mechanism, but it takes time. So make sure you read that discussion in the book about vasectomies and how long it takes for them to be effective and what has to go on there. It's not a surgery today and sterile tomorrow kind of concept. So just keep that in mind. Really, you're looking at a couple of months after the surgery, at which point you're going to be considered actually sterile at that point. We could spend hours and hours more talking about these systems more in greater detail, but hopefully this all made sense and you learned a lot. Some of you perhaps might feel you learned more than you wanted to. If you feel that way about this, then hang on. The birth and delivery chapter is going to be a real whiz-bang for you on that one. So anyway, I hope you had a good time here, and thanks for joining us. See you next time.